9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors is my favorite game that I've ever played. I picked it up on a whim while browsing Amazon because it looked interesting, and it ended up blowing me away. The setting, the story, the characters, the atmosphere, everything about the game hooked me almost immediately. It's a game that I thought a lot about after beating it. It was nice to see that so many others enjoyed the game as well, with most gaming sites giving it 9s and even 10s. Most who played it also shared the sentiment that this game was special, a game worth experiencing. However, as good as the game was, it sold poorly. Perhaps because it was a niche genre that didn't cater to those who were fans of that genre. Most visual novels were very anime and over the top, but this one aimed for a more Western style, while clearly still having Japanese influence. The game did a lot better in the West than in Japan though, enough so that a sequel was released, which also got poor sales. Virtue's Last Reward was grander and longer than 999, and most fans were very pleased with it. But because of poor sales, the series was in jeopardy of never having a third game, which would conclude the series. Long story short, after the fanbase diligently worked and showed that they wanted the third game, they got their wish. Zero Time Dilemma was eventually released and everyone was happy. Kind of. Shortly after the release of Zero Time Dilemma, it was announced that the first game, 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors, was going to be ported alongside Virtue's Last Reward to PS4 and Steam, allowing easier access to the first two games in the series since they could only be bought on handhelds beforehand. After the release of the port, people started to discuss which version of the game was the better version. The port changed a lot about the original game. Several quality of life improvements made the game a lot easier to get into and gave you more options, but the writing of the game had to change in order to fit its unique story on consoles, which came in the form of two new modes you could switch between, a novel mode and an adventure mode. One side would discuss that the game is a lot better than it was before because of the quality of life improvements, while the other side would argue that the story was affected in a negative way. From what I've read around online, it looks like the divide comes from how much you prioritize ease of use, or the game aspect of it over the story aspect. Both are important to the audience, but depending on where you lean, you might prefer one version over the other. I think KayJulers said it best in his analysis of the game.
When considering the various versions, I regard the DS version as the strongest for storytelling purposes, but the Nonary Games version has several big advantages at the cost of that narrative strength.
Now, with that out of the way, I won't hide where my biases lie. I'm someone who likes a good story over a good game. I largely prefer the DS version over the port. Admittedly, the story is the biggest factor when it comes to why this is my favorite game of all time. Because of this, the vast majority of the video will be discussing how the writing of the game had to change in order to transfer it to other consoles and why it led to disappointment for me. I'll be discussing how the narration and the character dialogue needed to be changed. I'll then go into the quality of life changes the game has and how that made the port a better experience gameplay wise. I released this video about a month ago, but I went into massive spoilers for the game. So for this video, I will not be going into any spoilers or important plot details. This video is for people who have not played 999 and to show just how different the two versions of the game can be. To do this, I'll be covering a lot from the beginning of the game and will be using spoiler-free examples found later in the game. A fair warning though, as I said already, I am heavily biased towards the DS version. Even though I do think the port may be better suited for some people, I'd be lying if I told you I wasn't trying to convince people to play the original version at least a little bit. You might find that the things I complain about in the video won't bother you at all, and that's fine. If that's the case, then this video should let you know which version of the game you'd like better. But, because of my biases, I do get heated a few times throughout the video and end up being very aggressive towards the port with my dissatisfaction towards it. So if that's something you don't think that you'd enjoy, it's understandable if you don't want to watch it. I have strong opinions and end up using very strong wording throughout the video, but please don't interpret that as me trying to state my opinion as fact. The purpose of this video is not to try and convince you that the DS version of 999 is superior to the port. This video also, more than anything, isn't trying to convince you that the port is a bad game. However, personally, the port of the game is disappointing, and with the very nature of the original version, there wasn't any way that the port could have stayed faithful without feeling forced in some way. So, first things first, 999 as a whole has a great thought-provoking story with deep and interesting characters. The premise and the setting of the game is pretty simple. Junpei, a college student, wakes up and finds that he's been kidnapped and put on a sinking ship with 8 other people. Junpei and the others are told by their captor that they're going to participate in the Nonary game, a game he simply explains as a game that you'll put your life on the line. Basically, it has a lot to do with the number 9 and math and stuff I don't know. He tells the 9 participants that they have 9 hours to find a door that carries a 9. fine, and if they don't succeed that they will all drown. The game has a bunch of rules the characters need to follow, or a bomb that is now inside of them will explode. Each character is assigned a number, and they must work together by entering doors, 3 to 5 people at a time, and solving the puzzles in those rooms. The game has a lot more to it than that, but that's pretty much it in a nutshell. I've never had a game, or even any form of media, make me think about its story as much as 999 did. It was that good. It had me at the edge of my seat nearly the entire game, made me suspicious of characters and their motives. It made me theorize and then rethink the entirety of the game when new information came along. And with the build-up the game had towards its finale, it blew my mind harder than anything I've experienced before or since. 999 was made for the Nintendo DS, a system which had a large focus on having 2 screens, the second of which functioning as a touchscreen, which was unheard of at the time, especially for video games. With 999 being a visual novel, the writers took advantage of the 2 screens by including the narration on the bottom screen while the character dialogue would be on the top screen. Because of the nature of the story's narration, it became vital to understanding the plot. Without it, the game wouldn't just not make any sense, but important moments wouldn't have any build-up anymore. They would be out of place, something that came out of nowhere. Without it, Junpei's thoughts and feelings couldn't be expressed. Things that are obvious to the cast but not to the audience would go unexplained. So, when porting the game over, the writers made the unique decision to give the game 2 different modes you could switch between. Adventure mode, which included just the character dialogue, and novel mode, which added narration to the dialogue. They give you the option to freely switch between these modes, but because of this change, they ran into another problem. People are most likely going to pick one mode and stick to it throughout the entire game. This isn't a problem for people who pick novel mode. They get all the information they need. But what about the people who choose adventure mode? As said before, the narration is essential to understanding the story. So how do you fix a problem like this? What can they do to make both modes make complete sense in regard to the story? In the end, they use 2 methods to try and fix this dilemma. The first is force switching between the 2 modes when important information is being given through the narration. This method is used very sparingly for whatever reason, however. There are only a few moments in the game where they force switch you into novel mode. Instead, the method they used primarily was transferring lines of narration over to the character's dialogue. With this change, you can now get all the important information you need no matter which mode you're currently in. Perhaps they thought this was the best option, because it was either that or keeping it the same as the DS version with the top and bottom screen being unchanged when porting the game, which would lose important story information for those who mainly stayed in adventure mode. On paper, this should work great. This way, everyone can understand and experience the story. It should work fine, right? Those who choose adventure mode have the benefit of not having extra text getting in the way, having more room for interpretation, and making the progression of the story faster. And those who choose novel mode have the benefit of building a chilling atmosphere as well as additional detail to the story. This should work fine, right? Okay, I won't beat around the bush and just come right out and say it. This simple change to the game causes problems with the writing, especially the first 2 or 3 hours of the game. Granted, it doesn't make the story bad, but a lot of the magic of the DS version is lost in translation from handheld to console. A lot of the plot points don't hit nearly as hard and can often be more confusing overall in an already convoluted game. Shockingly, the inclusion of the 2 new modes is the one change I see very few people talk about. Most discussions revolve around the quality of life changes. When novel and adventure mode is brought up, the discussion usually revolves around if the lack of narration creates more or less of an impact in the game. Is the game as atmospheric in adventure mode? Does novel mode tell you too much and leave too little to your imagination? It's an interesting discussion. However, I rarely see these discussions talk about the impact of the writing that was changed in order to fit these new modes. I'm talking about the actual writing and character dialogue and how it had to change. Out of all the research I did, I was only able to find 4 instances of people bringing this up. Unlike the DS version, the narration isn't necessary to understanding the game in the port. In most cases, they took the line out and reworded it to make it fit into what the characters were currently saying. This is a smart way to compensate for only having one screen while still having the story remain the same. However, the way in which they handled it is questionable at best. For example, at the beginning of the game when the group is trying to see if there's an easier way out, Junpei looks to the ceiling and sees that it's bolted shut with a metal plate. In the DS version, the narration adds 2 lines before moving on, mentioning that a metal plate was covering what seemed to be a glass dome and that nothing but an explosion was likely to damage it. It's a quick scene, lasting maybe 10 seconds with your average reading speed. Not super important. In fact, it probably wouldn't change the narrative at all if it was left out, but at least it drives the point home that they're stuck. So, imagine you're porting this game and need to convey this scene without the use of narration for the people who aren't in novel mode. How would you handle it? Perhaps Junpei could quickly look at the ceiling and in frustration say that it's no good either and that it's being sealed by a metal plate. Perhaps another character can chime in expressing their frustration as well. Something like this would be quick and convey the same message as the original version. The port, however, feels the need to copy every bit of narration to a T and give it to the characters. Junpei looking at the ceiling. Check. Someone mentioning it looking like a dome. Check. Something being said about it being a metal plate. Check. They even felt the need to add a bit of dialogue to Clover so Santa could respond with the explosives comment. Though I find this method questionable, it's not a terrible way of doing it if done right. However, the small sequence does feel a bit awkward. The visual should be enough to convey to the audience what they need to know without the narration. This makes the scene feel a bit forced, especially with the situation they found themselves in, and at the very beginning of the game to boot. By itself though, this 10-second scene isn't that big of a deal. Now imagine doing it this way throughout the entire game. The way they handled transferring the lines of narration to the characters drives me insane, and it's abundant in the first few hours of the game. There is so much information that needs to be given at the beginning of the game, but instead of forcing the player into novel mode, they try and transfer almost everything to the character dialogue. Even from the very beginning of the game, something just seems off. Junpei, for the first 20 or so minutes of the game, is by himself, and is presented immediately with a strange and unfamiliar setting. In the original, he's mostly silent while he's in the first escape room, saying just a few lines of dialogue to himself. During this time, however, the narration is giving us Junpei's thoughts and feelings, what he's experiencing, the questions he has, everything he's taking in. It's all important information because it establishes the setting of the game and Junpei's character. So, how does the port handle this scene?
I fell pretty far. That really hurt. Damn, my eyesight's kind of blurry. Must have hit my head. An earthquake! But it's shaking too fast for that. What's this? Is this keeping the door shut? Man, work was rough today.
Junpei endlessly talks to himself. Now, talking to yourself isn't inherently a bad thing, and I know some of you are already saying that this is normal. I can recall various times in media where a character is thinking to themselves about a problem or something similar, but Junpei isn't doing that here. He's narrating the story out loud to himself, and he never shuts up. In the DS version, from the time between when the game starts and starting the first puzzle, Junpei has 24 dialogue boxes. In the port, he has 53. The overabundance of this leads to lines that are not only unnecessary, but are just so forced and awkward.
Damn, my eyesight's kind of blurry. Must have hit my head.
Are we supposed to think that he's thinking in his head right now, or that like he's just self-narrating out loud to everybody?
I feel like there has to be like a third party, right?
An earthquake! But it's shaking too fast for that. Anyway.
That's the moment you say anyway?
Yeah.
An earthquake? Nah, it can't be that.
There's a lot of moments like that.
Maybe pushing something on this will work?
I wonder if he's talking out loud to himself in this room like this. Or if this is like inner monologue. If someone talked to themselves like this constantly, you know they crazy.
Man, work was rough today.
Who are you talking to?
Damn this water. Let me go.
Yeah, let me go, water. How dare you?
B deck. So we went from C deck to B deck.
Hurry. Hurry. A deck's next.
That's how the alphabet works.
Now, not every line of dialogue spoken to himself sounds forced. I can see myself in this situation saying some of these lines. But coupled together with everything else he says to himself constantly, it gets really obnoxious. Especially since it's literally non-stop as soon as you start the game. Too much of anything is a bad thing, and the amount that Junpei talks to himself just comes off as unnatural. In fact, the flashback that happens during the first puzzle room where Junpei is recalling his kidnapping has no dialogue spoken by him at all in the DS version. Not a single word is spoken to himself. It's shown to us naturally. Junpei coming to his house, noticing the window is open, shutting it, and bam, Zero is there and kidnaps him. The narration gives us a little more information regarding his college life and work, but it isn't much, and it doesn't feel forced because it was written with the narrator in mind. You can imagine though, that without the narration, the scene would just feel off. It would kind of feel a bit awkward for just the images to slowly show one after the other before Zero shows up. So, to fix this, they added 11 dialogue boxes in a scene that originally had none, and most of them are of him talking to himself. And yes, it's just as forced and awkward as that sounds.
I'm back. Not like anyone will respond. Man, work was rough today.
You know, as I played the port, nothing really bothered me about it until this point. Sure, the lines where Junpei talks to himself about seeing a bed, hitting his head, and feeling what seemed to be an earthquake were annoying, but it didn't set off any huge red flags. It was at this point in the game where I started to worry that this sort of thing would be common. Junpei constantly talking to himself in a super forced and awkward manner. And okay, look. It's normal to talk to yourself sometimes, but at this point Junpei has done nothing but that in 2 different situations, being in an unfamiliar place that is possibly dangerous, and in his normal everyday life coming home from work. In these 2 instances, isolated from each other, it wouldn't be too weird to add maybe a line or 2 where the character talks to himself, but this is already going overboard. It's an obnoxious way to be fed information. It's like the beginning of an anime starting off with the main character just narrating to themselves so the audience knows what's going on instead of just showing us what their life is like.
Hi, I'm so-and-so and I go to blank high school and this is my everyday life.
Can you imagine walking to school one day and then suddenly start talking to yourself about your life, your friends, your situation at home, how your school life is, and your entire life? This is what that feels like, but even worse. The game constantly has Junpei, and the other characters for that matter, point out really silly and obvious things to move the scene along. Perhaps because the game only has still images and character portraits to work with. But honestly, those should be enough without having to add annoying dialogue. It's so frustrating because I can't see any sane person acting like this. After a high pressure situation, one where you just barely escape and preserve your life and are probably having an adrenaline rush, can you imagine yourself saying something like this?
Whew, that felt too much like being flushed down a toilet. Damn.
I'd be freaking the crap out, not even thinking, trying to find my way to safety. I wouldn't stop and think to myself, oh, a door, eureka, that's my way to safety right there. But this accursed water, it is slowing down my movement and therefore decelerating my way to security. Okay, that's an extreme example, but honestly, it's everywhere in this game. So it gets to the point where I wouldn't even be surprised if Junpei did end up saying something like this. Things shown and seen directly to the player should be enough, but the game feels it necessary to add character dialogue to it anyway to state the obvious, and it drives me absolutely insane.
C-Deck!
Yeah, that's C-Deck. There's a massive zoom in on the place so that it's the only thing on screen. But okay, whatever, right? It's just him saying what's in front of him. No big deal when it's isolated.
B-Deck!
Like I said, in this game, it's never an isolated event because it's everywhere. It's so frustrating because it feels like every 15 seconds I'm telling the game to stop telling me what's right in front of my face. It's almost embarrassing how hammy these lines are. Who talks to themselves like this? It's like every time I wanted to start up playing again, another stupid line would be said.
Well, it registered my bracelet number, but it won't open with 1 person. We need at least 2 more people.
At this point of the game, we already know this. Junpei already knows this. Why does it need to be repeated by him? Heck, he's the one that read this out loud to everyone. Not only that, but mere minutes before this, he repeated it again in his head anyway to get the point across. This is literally the 3rd time he's gone through this. Why does Junpei need to repeat what the narrator says in the original? When things like this are stated in the narration, it comes off as much more natural because the narrator is the mediator between what's happening in the story and the audience. These things might not be obvious to the audience who isn't actually there. In the DS version, the narrator says that Junpei had scanned his number, but 2 more people were needed to open the door. That's it. In the port, Junpei essentially says the same thing to himself when he already knows it. This is a line that actually could have been excluded. Instead, it could have been something like him scanning his number, an ellipsis appearing to convey a pause, and then Junpei saying, hey, we need 2 more numbers, could someone give me a hand? And then present the options.
This should do it. Now we just need to pull the lever on the side.
Imagine if you actually spoke to yourself like this. Getting up in the morning and removing your covers.
Darn this blanket, let me go.
You get up and head to the kitchen and say every cereal name in your head before finally deciding on one.
Now I just need to raise my right hand and pick the 3rd cereal box to the left.
Like, no one does this. I mean, I'm not inside any of your heads or anything, but can you honestly tell me that you or anyone else is this obvious and detailed about everything you do when talking or thinking to yourself? During the scene where the cast is writing down what doors they want to go through on separate pieces of paper to determine who goes through what door, Junpei has a plan that he's already thought through before the scene even happens so that he can go through whatever door he desires. It wasn't shown to the audience before the scene though, so after he draws and his plan is successful, he finds it necessary to explain his plan to himself again in great detail, almost as if he were explaining it to someone else.
I had 3 pieces of paper ready, and I put the one with door 6 on it into the pot. I just needed to make sure I drew last. After I saw everyone else's result, I just chose whatever door I wanted. If the number I'd already put in matched, then I didn't have to switch the paper out.
Thanks for reaffirming that for yourself, Junpei. I was worried that you were going to forget after your plan succeeded. Yes, there are instances where Junpei talks to himself in the original. I'm arguing that talking to yourself to this extent is very unusual. The only times I catch myself talking to myself to this extent is when nothing else is happening around me, or I'm totally uninterested in my surroundings. Like trying to fall asleep at night, sitting through a boring lecture, or working at a super repetitive job. But Junpei and the others were kidnapped. Junpei barely escaped a flooding room. He is in an unfamiliar setting with strange and unfamiliar people. But I'm getting ahead of myself. After Junpei escapes the room and heads to A deck, he runs into the rest of the cast, and almost immediately we run into another problem. Similar to how Junpei just annoyingly talks to himself to no end. As soon as the other characters are introduced, they're given lines of narration to add to their dialogue. Except instead of just talking to themselves, they point out stupid and obvious things to each other.
This is a numbered door.
See what I mean? Do you see what I mean? About them, like, just pointing out the obvious? This is a numbered door!
And because the dialogue is so different from the original, other lines need to be changed as well so the scene can actually make sense. For example, one of Lotus's first lines to Junpei, "Hey, you, come on, hurry," is changed to fit the new dialogue Junpei was given from the narration.
I guess it's another one of us now.
A dancer?
No, I'm not. You better get moving.
The urgency is taken out.
Oh, well, okay then.
Actually, this entire scene of Junpei meeting the characters for the first time has no urgency at all anymore. Junpei doesn't seem to be worried, but is instead talking to himself about what these strangers look like to him. Not to mention that there's so much dialogue added that instead of it feeling like they're running past Junpei in a hurry, now it just feels like they're in a line waiting to introduce themselves to him. Because of these changes, a lot of the tension from the original game is gone. Moments of silence that were supposed to be stressful for the characters and the audience end up being ineffective because someone has to say something to compensate for the lack of narration. That was all one sentence. There are so many examples where they really didn't need to add lines from the narration. In the original version, as you're meeting all the characters for the first time, as they're rushing by, the narration gives them all a descriptive title since they are in too much of a hurry to introduce themselves. Santa is silver, Ace is lion, 7 is mountain, and so on. This information actually isn't important to the story, it just gives it more personality and character. Now, it's important for the sake of the audience so they can be familiarized with these characters, but the information itself isn't important to understanding the story. It also isn't important because it is never alluded to again in the entire game. It's just a quirky way to introduce the characters. And because it isn't significant, it isn't necessary to translate it over for someone else to say. But hey, they went ahead and did that anyway. Most of the dialogue in the scene in the DS version are characters muttering to themselves and telling Junpei to hurry up as they run by. In the port, the scene is slowed down dramatically to fit this information that isn't actually important. Junpei talks to the others and to himself about what the others look like.
Just what is going on? There's an old man like a lion, a girl with pink hair, and a prince, and I have no idea what they're talking about.
Doesn't sound natural at all. Like, imagine describing someone you just met like this in front of their face.
That glasses guy with hair like a bird's nest.
Whether it's important dialogue or not, the writers deemed it necessary to give it to the characters. It happens.
What is this? It looks like a lowercase h with a dash drawn across the upper stem of the h.
So often. What is this would have been fine. This is a literal actual copy of the narration taken over to the dialogue. This bears repeating. Things that sound natural with narration doesn't necessarily mean they'll sound natural if someone actually says it out loud.
A beep? Did that thing just make that sound?
How am I still pausing the game and ranting about this? I can see it happening a few times, but oh my gosh, how does it just keep happening? There are so many times where I would say no crap when playing the port because of how obnoxious it is for them to always point out the obvious and describe their surroundings to everyone, even though everyone in the room should already know.
The display changed from engaged to vacant.
The game tries to make these changes to the text seem as natural as possible, even trying to throw some kind of logic in there.
I think we should look at the metal doors by the big staircase too. They're pretty suspicious.
Hey, old man, give me a hand. Using force, I see.
All this extra dialogue just makes it seem like even more of a stretch that they were actually on this boat for 9 hours.
Using force, I see. Let's give it a try.
Thanks, Lion. I see this method. What a novelite approach.
Granted, this is a problem in the original as well, like the others trying to find a different way to escape when they should have just clearly played the game, but it's a much bigger problem in the port. I've mentioned this briefly before, but I think the game would have benefited greatly by force switching into novel mode more often than it does. A lot of these terrible lines wouldn't be necessary, as they'd be able to keep the original script intact for that section. And, wouldn't you know it, the next part of the game has a perfect example of this. After being introduced to the rest of the cast, you run into the last of the main characters, Ahhhhhmm. For this scene, the game switches you forcefully into novel mode for the first time, as the narration for this scene is very important. As you can expect, very little from the scene was altered in any way from the DS version. Now, to reiterate, altering something isn't inherently bad. I'm not complaining about the port because they're different, but because of the way it was handled. Right here though, because it's forced into novel mode, they could transfer the script over without changing anything. People say that it's fine to play the game only in adventure mode because the game will switch you to novel mode when it's important. Here's the thing though, the game only does this a total of 5 times in its entirety. Twice if you're only going through the necessary routes to beat the game. A game where the narration is so important to understanding its 25+ hour story only shows up 5 times. There are a lot of intense scenes where they just decide to transfer the lines over instead of forcing you into novel mode, and some endings even do this. So many of these problems we've been talking about since the beginning of the video could have been fixed if they just switched to novel mode more often. Junpei constantly talking to himself, the character's unnatural dialogue and always stating the obvious, everything. But as it currently is, it doesn't switch nearly as often as it should. Gosh man, I want to say that the writing in this game is good. I want to say that the characters all act and speak naturally. I want to say that the novel and adventure modes were handled well and that everything works seamlessly. Of course I want to say these things. This is my favorite game of all time. Of course I want to say positive things about it. Of course I want to recommend it to others, but I just can't bring myself to do it after playing through the port. And I know this is only my opinion, but I'm just so done with this game. And I'm done beating around the bush. This sucks. This is bad writing. It's terrible, awkward, forced, and really distracting. It muddies a game with a great story. It's like if movie adaptations to books felt the need to have every single line of narration added to the character dialogue to get the full experience. Sure, you can now watch your favorite book in its entirety as a movie, but does that mean that the movie adaptation is actually good? It's getting harder and harder for me to keep saying that the port is still a good option, and we still haven't talked about everything. Am I crazy? Am I overreacting? Am I the only person that's bothered by this? Like, this was originally going to be a simple 10-minute video explaining how the ending of the game was affected in the port. Nothing controversial. Everyone seems to agree that the DS version handled it better. I wasn't expecting to make an hour-long video of me railing on the port. I mean, confession time, I guess. Before making this video, I never actually played the port. I just knew that important plot points were negatively affected by watching people play the game on Twitch. So when I actually started playing it to make this video, imagine my surprise when the dialogue was this awful. I had to go back to the DS version to make sure that my nostalgia wasn't clouding my judgment. But you get my point. I have more written down in my notes about other lines that bothered me and that highlight somewhat different problems, but you get it. I don't like how they handle transferring the lines of narration over to the character dialogue. These issues happen so often after you start the game that when I was first writing this, I almost thought that the entire game would be like this. But like, it isn't. For some reason, sometime after doors 3, 7, and 8, the terrible writing and dialogue slows down quite a bit. It went from me pausing the game every 30 seconds to rant, to me normally playing the game. Now, it's still present throughout the game, and we've talked about a few instances of it happening later in the game, but instead of it happening once every 30 seconds, it happens once every 10 to 15 minutes, which is a massive improvement. Junpei, for the most part, doesn't constantly talk to himself anymore. The character's dialogue isn't stupid or cringy. It mostly becomes the game I know and love. This might be because most information in the narration at this point isn't needed as much in order to understand the story, so perhaps that's why it didn't feel the need to copy any more of it to the character dialogue. Granted, I still think that being in adventure mode puts you in a lesser position than in novel mode, depending on your preferences, I guess, but it overall becomes a better game. So, does that mean the rest of the game is fine then? The script more or less fixes itself after you get past the beginning, so is the game the same experience after this point? Should you power through the beginning to experience the rest of the game? Well... It's complicated.
Jeff Probst.
Consider this a privilege. You have been chosen.
Let's take a break from talking about the negatives for a moment and discuss the positives the port brought, because I'm gonna be yelling again in 10 minutes and I need a breather. The quality of life changes added to the port are great. A lot of the problems that the DS version had were fixed in the port. Some of the main gripes people had with the original are as follows: slow, unskippable text, starting over from the beginning of the game after getting an ending, and the lack of clear direction on where to go and what choices lead to what endings. Not only did they fix these problems, but other things were upgraded as well, such as upgrading the sprite work of the original to make it look cleaner. As much as I love it, 999 isn't a perfect game, and the DS version has its share of problems. Something that would always get an audible groan out of me when playing the original is if I accidentally clicked on an object in a puzzle room right after I had finished reading it. The text crawl in this game is slow and set at 1 speed. You cannot skip it. So of course, I'd be mashing on the touchscreen to finish the text, only for me to accidentally click on the same object again. Fun times. So thank goodness that's not a problem in the port anymore. If that same example were to happen in the port, you could actually just mash your way through the text and be done with it in a flash. It's also helpful during the story since you can play the game at your own pace if you're okay with cutting the character's voice acting mid-sentence. The slow crawling text in the DS version was annoying enough for someone to create a mod of 999 where the text is faster. A literal mod of 999 that does nothing else but speed the text up. That's how annoying it could get. Something that actually wasn't a problem in the original version were the character sprites, but they went ahead and upgraded those too. To be honest, it would be kind of jarring to see the sprites on an HD TV. Every character looks very clean now, and some even have added details. There are some examples where the upgraded models look a little awkward, mainly the ninth man looking away from you instead of at you, but for the most part it's all very nice looking. However, that doesn't mean that the sprite work in the DS version is bad. It's upscaled in the port for sure, but the sprite work in the DS version still looks great. I wouldn't say that going from the port to the DS version would be a downgrade to the character models. It's like saying that going from the upgraded version of Bowser's Inside Story for 3DS to the original on DS is a downgrade when the graphics for each version looks great. The sprites don't look bad and have a certain charm to them. And heck, with games like Phoenix Wright, I still prefer the DS sprite models over the upgraded ones. One downside is that even though they did upgrade the character models, a lot of things went untouched, like some puzzle rooms and still images. Some things transferred over well and still looks good without really doing much to the models. But then you have things like this, or this, where it looks either pixelated or smeared. Kind of a stark contrast to the great looking character models. It's not enough to pull you out of the experience, it's just kind of off-putting. With that out of the way, one of the biggest quality of life changes is the voice acting, with the option to choose between the English and Japanese dub. Voice acting in itself brings an interesting discussion about creative interpretation. One argument in favor of adventure mode goes something like this: not having narration leaves more room for interpretation, and therefore is better than novel mode. Honestly, I think that argument kind of goes against the game as much as it goes in favor of it. Having voice acting in this game is, in a way, having less room for interpretation than in the DS version. Much like reading a book over its movie adaptation, on the DS, you give the characters different, unique voices and every line of dialogue is performed in your head. With the inclusion of voice acting, it's done for you. Don't get me wrong, I don't think either option is better than the other, but that the argument can go both ways. In fact, it's probably the most common comment I see from a veteran player when hearing the voice acting for the first time. This isn't how they sounded in my head, but that's to be expected, right? Personally, I think the voice acting in the port is good, even if I prefer not to have it on. I'd say the majority of the cast is great. There are a few hiccups here and there though.
Using force, I see.
But these instances are occasional, only happening every so often. They can be annoying, but it doesn't happen so often that it takes you away from the game. By itself. I think the nature of the over-the-top writing kind of makes for some awkward deliveries, but it's not an inherently bad thing and most people get used to it. Though I'll never be able to take Junpei constantly talking to himself seriously, no matter what language it's in or how well it's voice acted. Despite the characters not sounding the same as they were in my head, I don't think anyone has a particularly bad performance. However, there are some bizarre creative directions they took when it came to the voice acting, especially with the English dub.
Knockout gas. Thanks, Geek Name.
Consider this a privilege. You have been chosen.
Oh, I don't know about this voice.
Zero's distorted voice is bad. There's no other way around it. It's bad. Perhaps they wanted the voice to get a reaction out of people, because you could argue that the voice creates fear or discomfort. It's also debatable whether the voice fits the original description or not either.
A rasping voice wormed its way out of the gas mask.
You think that's raspy?
Listen, they did the writing before they did the voice acting.
Zero's voice does not create fear though, it's just funny. I'm sure it'd be scary if I were to hear it in real life, but that's only because I wouldn't be able to understand a single thing this guy was saying. If it weren't for the subtitles, I would be completely lost. The fact that the characters can understand anything this guy is saying is beyond me.
Exactly. What? I don't know what he said. I closed my eyes and I have no idea.
If I were to cover up Zero's dialogue box, could you honestly tell me that you don't have any problems understanding him at all? This takes the sinister impression I had for this guy and deformed it into something I can't take seriously at all. It's so freaking goofy that I can't help but get frustrated because it takes me out of the game. The booping noises in the original gave the impression that his voice sounded a lot more ominous and disturbing. With that said though, it's not actually a huge problem. Even though Zero's voice does bother me, it's just one voice in a game where the majority of the voice acting is good. But Zero is the main antagonist. I'd love it if I felt threatened at all by this guy. But like I said, it's not that big of a deal. No, there's a different questionable decision that takes me out of the experience worse than Zero does, and it does so far more often. It happens in the form of ellipsis. An ellipsis is usually used for pauses and silences, and 999 uses them several times throughout the game. There are many times when the characters will react with silence for various reasons. In the port, it upped the number of times the characters did it because of the new dialogue they added or changed. That itself shouldn't be a problem. But, for some miserable reason, they decided that it would be a good idea to have the characters grunt and gasp every single time an ellipsis shows up on screen. Okay, so like, imagine, you're playing the game and it gets to the point where the atmosphere changes into a serious tone and the game is trying to build tension. Serious moments like this happen in the game often, by the way, whether it's new information about the characters or something shocking happening. And many of these scenes will, appropriately, have the characters react in silence. Unless you're playing the port, that is.
That guy won't stop shouting. And the others.
The tension or the atmosphere the game is trying to build is killed almost instantly by how freaking funny it is to have the characters react in this way. And when I say that a character makes noise each time an ellipsis shows up, I mean each and every time a character is given an ellipsis. Why the heck do they have to have a voice clip for every single time they come up? It's already hard enough for me to take the game seriously because of everything we've talked about so far, but it makes it even harder when every ellipsis in the game is someone breathing, gasping, or making some other weird noise. And unlike most of the character dialogue, the ellipsis problem never goes away throughout the entire game. Can I please just have one moment with this game? One moment that's not ruined by Junpei talking to himself, the characters pointing out stupid and obvious things, Zero's goofy voice, the occasional awkward voice directing, or an ellipsis? It's like it never ends. If it's not one thing, it's one of the others. The bad writing finally eases up around the 2-hour mark, but then you have to deal with everything else. I just want to be immersed in this world, but it's impossible when something happens every few minutes. When I first played 999 on the DS, I was so immersed that it didn't let go of my attention until I beat it. Yes, there are negative aspects present in the original as well, and I can give several examples of them, but it happening every once in a while compared to once every couple minutes is a huge difference. At first, I thought they were just trying to imitate the Japanese dub because anime has a tendency to do that with their characters, making over-exaggerated grunts and noise at the slightest indication of movement. But the Japanese dub actually doesn't do this at all. The ellipsis in the Japanese dub actually indicates silence for the characters. Holy crap, dude! I have no idea why they added this to the English version. It just makes the characters sound silly.
You know, most of these problems would be solved if you just turn the voices off. The game gives you that option.
Yeah. This is a fair point. If you can't stand the ellipses like me, you can simply turn the voices off so you don't have to hear them. That also fixes the awkward deliveries that you hear from the voice actors every so often. However, I'd argue that when a game has a feature that you're not using, it feels like you're missing out. If the option to turn it off is only for the people who played the DS version, then why can't I have my booping noises? I like my booping noises. especially when I'm in novel mode at all times and both the narration and the character dialogue fill the entire screen. It can be hard to tell who's speaking or not when the voices are completely turned off. Having the characters speak and having no noise to indicate it makes it lack life and personality. Compare turning the voices off yourself and hearing the characters speak in silence to when you enter a puzzle room, where the game turns off the voices manually and do give you the booping noises. With all the playthroughs I've watched, most people I've seen will not turn the voices off, and I've seen maybe one example of someone changing it to Japanese. Like I just said, changing it to Japanese does get rid of the ellipsis problem and the problem with the questionable voice directing that pops up every once in a while, but everything else we've discussed so far is still present. Of all the quality of life changes, though, the most divisive one amongst fans would have to be the flowchart. I think it's the most significant quality of life change added to the game, both in a good and a bad way, because it's a great change gameplay-wise and does wonders for the pacing of the game, but from a storytelling perspective, I think it's detrimental. And I'm clearly not the only one that thinks so, but I do find it strange because the flowchart does make the flow of the game and the overall experience better. Yet people will continue to say that it's damaging to the story of the game. There are several reasons behind this, and it varies from person to person. But before we can get into that, it's important to understand why the flowchart is such a significant upgrade. One big problem the DS version has is having to start the game over from the beginning after getting an ending. This is probably the one thing that stops most people from playing the game to the very end more than anything else. I've seen a lot of comments online saying that they were finally able to finish the game through the port because they weren't forced to go back to the beginning. To make matters worse, you have to go through all the puzzle rooms again as well. None of this would have been a problem if they didn't handle the skip function so poorly. After getting an ending, you have the option to skip text you've already seen. The problem is that it's just so slow. For example, it takes around 8 to 10 minutes to skip from the very beginning of the game to the first choice, choosing between doors 4 and 5. That's a freaking long time. In that amount of time, I can skip through the entirety of Kyo's route in Clannad, which took me about 6 minutes. That's significant because the time between the beginning of the game to the first option in 999 is roughly an hour. It took me 7 hours to get through Kyo's route in my original playthrough of Clannad. The game has 5, technically 6, endings, so going back to the beginning again and again can be taxing. Assuming you get every ending one after the other without getting an ending you've already seen, you'll probably spend 2 or 3 hours total just skipping text and redoing puzzle rooms, and that's a generous estimation. What makes it even worse is that it's very unclear to new players which choices you need to make in order to get every ending. It's practically a guessing game trying to figure out how to get to the true ending. 999 is a game that practically requires a guide if you don't want to waste a huge amount of time. I think most people are quick to catch on to that, though there are some that are stubborn when it comes to using guides in video games. I think it would have been great if skipping text was as fast as Clannad's and other visual novels, because, honestly, I think starting over from the beginning of the game is beneficial to the story of 999. And this is the part of the original video where I go into heavy spoilers for the game. There isn't much to talk about without the spoilers, to be completely honest, but I guess we can go into part 3 right here anyway. Yeah, okay. It's very difficult to explain why the narrative of 999 was hindered significantly for the port without going into massive spoilers. So, regarding the flowchart, I'll say this. There are certain aspects of the game where the flowchart arguably lessens the impact of the story, changes aspects of the narrative, and just makes it more difficult to understand the finale of the game. I believe that the creator of the game wanted the player to start over from the beginning, but know that some argue that it doesn't affect the story that much. From what I've described from the quality of life changes, you'll have to decide whether or not you can be patient when starting the game over after getting an ending. If you don't think you'll be able to finish it at all, then the port will at least make it possible for you to finish the game. But if you're willing to be patient, the experience is well worth it. Those who hold the DS version in such high regard often don't bring up these issues because it was worth it in the end. Or, at least, they didn't until the port came out and the flowchart became the central argument against the DS version. Just know that if you ultimately pick the port in the end, it's incredibly easy to miss a certain important scene. The scene has 2 different variations depending on the ending that you're headed towards. Just make sure that every time you're going through this part of the flowchart, to go through this novel section of the game again. The game should stop you when you're skipping text when new dialogue you haven't seen before is added. Now, aside from the flowchart, like I said before, it's hard to say anything about how the narrative and the finale of the game was changed without spoilers. Just doing some searching online, you can see people having a very difficult time saying anything about how it was changed. We always have to be vague and as broad as possible to not spoil anything or give away any possible hints. No wonder we have such a hard time convincing people to play the DS version. The ending of the game had such an enormous impact on so many people that we don't dare spoil anything so that others can have the same experience. We try to describe how the impact of the finale was significantly lessened in the port, but we can't even explain why. The other side of the argument has a much easier time convincing you to play the port because they'll downplay the original version and tell you that it doesn't matter which version you play, or that even if the story is a little less impactful, that it's worth it because of the quality of life changes. When you compare an argument like that to a side that won't tell you anything to avoid spoilers and to simply say that it's worth it in the end, it's no wonder why the other side has a much more convincing argument. To be honest, I simply can't do it. And I've tried. I can't go into detail on why the DS version is more impactful without spoiling it. Just know that when I talked about spoilers in the other video when comparing the two versions, it went on for another 18 minutes before I wrapped things up. The implications of the changes made to the port are huge, and I can't help but feel that the overall impact of the game was severely lessened. Near the end of the video, I wanted to convey that even though a lot of these changes made me angry, at the end of the day it just made me feel very sad. This is my favorite game ever, but when I look at the port, I don't see that game anymore. I see a game that not only lost its impact, but also its atmosphere, tension, almost its very identity. It's like not seeing a friend for a long time and meeting up for the first time in years just to see that they're not the same person that they used to be. You don't have that same chemistry you had before. Things are awkward now. It's an uncomfortable experience when you're expecting things to be the same. There will be those that argue otherwise, and I don't want to belittle their arguments. But for me, it's honestly hard to recommend this game anymore. I got so numb to the port while making this video that I started to question myself on the things that I was arguing. But after starting the DS version for a second time after editing for so long, I felt the change immediately. There was a stark contrast between the two versions. The original version from the get-go starts with an atmosphere and tension that the port just simply doesn't have. It pains me that I can't recommend this game in good faith anymore. Recommending it would also be going into an explanation about the port and why I think the DS version is the best way to go. Of course they'll ask about the port, so I have to say that other people liked it. Other people think it's the best version. Other people recommend that version over the original. Because what value does my opinion hold over a sea of thousands? I know they'll just end up playing the port in the end because it's the cheapest, most accessible, and more visually appealing option. Either that, or they'll just download a ROM, which would be fine, except for some reason the actual ROM of 999 doesn't work very well with the default settings for most DS emulators. On most DS playthroughs you can find on YouTube, the majority of the footage looks really blocky and jagged, and the audio quality is pretty terrible too. So if someone were to theoretically download 999 on a ROM, they'd need to mess around with the graphic and audio settings and make sure that it actually looks and sounds normal. Ugh. I'm done comparing the two versions of the game. I really needed to get it off my chest as I've been holding it in for a while now. I honestly wish I could get over the changes they made to the writing, especially since the quality of life changes are so great. But I can't. I tried to look over the dialogue, tried to assume that maybe a group of people could normally act like this. I tried to put myself in the shoes of someone who's never played the game. I tried to give it a pass. Tried to figure out why so many people don't have a problem with it. Tried to play devil's advocate with myself to validate the awkward writing and creative decisions. But I soon realized that I shouldn't have to try and justify and rationalize these things. I should be able to just recommend the game without having to warn them about something. I should be able to recommend it with full confidence, without any extra BS like telling them to expect awkward character dialogue or how playing in a certain mode is the best way to experience the game. But I can't do that with the port. The only version I can recommend without any strings attached, despite its shortcomings, is the original. There are still plenty of reasons to like the port, as I touched upon a few times during the duration of the video. The quality of life changes are great, the character models look cleaner, the flowchart paces the game in a better way, voice acting is a nice option to have, being able to skip text when before the text was always at a fixed, unskippable speed, these are all nice changes. But when it comes down to it, are these changes really enough to justify the negative changes to the writing? I want to reiterate that the port of 999 is not a bad game, as much as I hate saying that, and that everything I've said is more or less me trying trying to explain why I was personally disappointed with the game rather than trying to convince you that it's lesser than the original version. The story is still good despite the poorly written dialogue, and even with the more important moments losing their impact, the majority of the game is still interesting and engaging. I had my issues with it obviously, but when it comes down to evaluating it as a whole, it's still a good game. I'm sure you can make just as many arguments against the DS version as I did with the port, and it's not like everyone that's ever played the DS version loved it to death like I did.
I do feel like a lot of dialogue in this game is extraordinarily repetitive and redundant. Which again, I guess it was kind of a style choice. They wanted to make absolutely sure that nobody has any questions about what they're supposed to do right now.
And it'd be really cool if those of you who do have those arguments commented so we can have a discussion about it. However, when it comes to the changes that they made to the game to fit it on one screen, I feel that the magic that made the original so special to me and others is lost. If you have no other way of playing 999, then the port is still a good option. Plus, the port comes bundled with its sequel, Virtue's Last Reward, which is still great no matter what system you're playing it on. However, if you're asking me for my recommendation, then the choice is clear and obvious. It will always be the DS version. Personally, I don't think I'll ever go back to the port. I probably won't be replaying the game for a few years anyway because of how many times I had to watch and play it for this video. It's unfortunate that buying the original version is so expensive now, but in my opinion, it's worth it.